and welcome to Ipsy Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'll be your host for this episode. I'm Guy Hamilton Smith, legal fellow with the Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Resource Center at the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law. My guest today is Hadar Aviram, Thomas Miller Professor of Law at the UC Hastings College of the Law, and we will be discussing her paper, Progressive Punitivism, Notes on the Use of Punitive Social Control to Advance Social Justice Ends. Hadar, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we had sort of talked a bit about progressive punitivism at Law and Society, and we were kind of thinking along similar wavelengths with projects that we were working on. And I'm wondering if you can sort of give us a little bit of an introduction into when we talk about progressive punitivism. What do we, or I guess I should back up. When we say punitivism, what are we talking about exactly?
So punitivism is essentially, I would say, in the air in the United States. And it's something that everybody of all political stripes has been growing up with for the last 5 decades at least. And it's the basic notion that criminal justice is the main way for us to solve social problems. So it's a lack of imagination in the sense that every problem that we face as a society can be solved if we resort to the criminal justice system or to punishment or to sanctions or to shaming or something along those lines to solve that problem. If you will, it's as if we're builders, the only hammer that we have is the criminal justice hammer, and everything looks like a nail, which is something that we've extensively documented in works, going back for decades, that this has become the main way through which America governs.
And so the title progressive punitivism would indicate that there are multiple flavors of punitivism. There would be a progressive variety and a conservative variety. And I'm wondering if you can illustrate what those differences might be for the people who are listening.
Sure. In general, punitivism tends to be associated with more conservative ideologies. And that's because it's essentially been marshaled over the years as a tool of the powerful, the economically powerful. It's oppressed people who are poor. It's oppressed people of color. And people tend to perceive overall the hand of punitivism as a conservative hand. Now, there has been some work over the years, especially more recent work, documenting that punitivism has been employed by Democrat governments and politicians. Jonathan Simon famously says in Governing Through Crime, really no politician, Republican or Democrat, can afford to be seen as soft on crime. And Elizabeth Hinton writes about how Nixon, who's usually perceived as one of the kind of bad boogeymen of law and order, was actually in many ways continuing things that Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy had done before him, rather than being a complete deviation. So the idea that people from all political stripes can be punitive or can advance punitive ideologies is not new. What I'm trying to highlight in this piece is a particular flavor of punitivism, and it's the one that's being used primarily by progressive, radical activists, both in the mainstream and in social media, and also by some of us in academia, where we're trying to use punitive measures, either through the formal criminal justice system, so, demanding that people be arrested and charged and prosecuted and convicted and severely punished, or by, shaming, stigmatizing, destroying people on social media. And we do this because we think that is the way to advance social justice ends. So essentially using these shaming, stigmatization, harsh punishment, denial of rehabilitation in the service of social equality. And this is a logic that has permeated much of the political conversation on the progressive left. And it even has some foothold in academia, although I think mostly we see it operating in social media. And what I do in this piece is I try to map out what this ideology looks like.
And so what do you see when we talk about, the ends of social equality? What areas do you take progressive punitivism as primarily or operating in? Or are there areas where there seems to be focused effort where progressive punitivism really seems to, take center stage?
So this paper identifies 3 such areas. And in all of these 3 areas, you're going to see similar things. So first of all, you're going to see how the the punitive machine is sort of turned 180 degrees away from the powerless and onto the powerful. It comes from a place of identity politics and group politics, as sort of an epistemological resource for identifying kind of like who's the bad guy. And the concept that's pretty important to me in this piece is the idea of ratcheting up punishment, which is to say, if we're used to seeing, the powerless being punished more harshly than the powerful, we're not going to be more lenient with the powerless. Rather, we're going to become more harsh toward the powerful, right? And then there's the idea that doing these things is going to open up a conversation. It's going to start a reckoning. It's going to bring about kind of, a national conversation that's going to make things better. And from saying that, I'm sure some of our readers already are getting a hint of what are some of the main areas where it operates. So one place where I see this operating is in the context of police abuse of force. A considerable amount of the movement towards essentially modifying the way we're doing policing in this country, both over enforcement and under enforcement, has been dedicated to the pursuit of criminal justice against individual police officers who have had abuse of force, lethal force, and the like. Many of the big protests that we've seen in Ferguson and beyond focus on this idea that they're ignited by the criminal justice system's perceived unresponsiveness to the public's need to harshly punish this individual. So that's one area. Then there's the area that some researchers have called carceral feminism. And for me, carceral feminism is part of this general trend of progressive punitivism. And this is how punitivism operates in the Me Too context. Me Too starts off as this very laudable move to hear stories of people, to understand how general and how pervasive the problem of sexual assault and sexual abuse and sexual harassment is. But then it becomes this very energetic crusade to very harshly punish not only the perpetrators, but also, for example, judges who are perceived to be lenient on the perpetrators. And then the third area that I look at in the piece is the area of hate crimes. So the idea is that the concerted effort to focus on hate criminals and define them as terrorists, which is perceived as this corrective course of, we only perceive brown-skinned Muslim, people who kill as terrorists. Let's look at white supremacists as terrorists and how can we punish them? And also the social media effort to, shame and destroy people who engage in these behaviors, which admittedly are, at best ugly and at worst, murderous and dangerous. That is also a focal point of this progressive punitivist energy.
And so, I think obviously there are a lot of people who, don't see this progressive punitive energy as necessarily being a bad thing. But I mean, all of these instances, all these areas that you talk about, there are obviously these, I think you refer to them in your paper as red ball crimes that occur in these, in these sectors, if you will, that, are, as you pointed out, are atrocious. And so, and like I said, there are a lot of people who see this progressive punitivism as something that's good and desirable. And so I'm curious, what ways do you think that this punitivism might backfire if the goals are to, achieve these social justice ends, to rectify, these crimes or bad behavior or whatever you want, whatever is seeking to be addressed?
So I should probably point out that writing a piece like this is something that has taken me several years precisely because of what you say, because there are many people who are pursuing these avenues to get justice because they think that they're good and they're laudable. And ultimately, what many of us who are more on the progressive end of the spectrum share is a similar vision of the kind of world that we would like to live in. So the people that I criticize in this piece, or the ideologies that I criticize in this piece, the ultimate end goal is not that different from the kind of world that I want to live in. I too would like to live in a world where there's equality, where people respect each other, where there's more economic equality, where there's more respect for diversity, where people are not threatened and they feel safe. I would like to live in that world as well. I think where we differ is on the way to get there, right? And I see many of the things that this move toward progressive punitivism brought in its wings, especially in the course of the Trump administration, as being counterproductive. The first thing that I think is a problem is that by pursuing justice against particular individuals, we're putting an emphasis on punishing wrongdoers as if there's some kind of personal failing or personal pathology there. And that takes away a lot of the strength of the argument that says, no, this is actually part of something structural. For me, one of the classic examples is the Kavanaugh hearings and the way they were perceived on the left. There's all this focus on, Kavanaugh's personal pathology and what a horrible person he is and how dishonest he is and what a misogynist he is. And this weakens the broadened takeaway from these hearings that lamentably Kavanaugh is a man of his time and place. And what he's done is not an outlier. It's just something that happens more broadly. So we're basically normalizing the cultural petri dish in which this happens and highlighting people that have supposedly personal pathologies. And this problem is also evident in the movement to remove due process protections for people. So, for example, California has introduced a law where in cases of cops that are accused of lethal force, there isn't going to be a grand jury. And to me, that's a very dangerous move because what that essentially says is we believe in due process. Due process is important for us, but only for people we like. The minute we're dealing with a defendant that we dislike, all the protections go out the window. The mayor of Oakland said, following a murder on BART on our train that was perceived as a hate crime, the perpetrator was white, the victim was a young African-American woman. She said, well, I think we should reverse the burden of proof for hate crimes. And I'm thinking, this is really dangerous. One day somebody's going to think you're a defendant that they don't like, and therefore you don't deserve due process, right? Then there's the fact that criminal justice in itself doesn't generate reform, right? You are not going to reform or fix a sick culture in a police department by punishing an individual cop. Certainly not by fining an individual cop that can't pay for it, not even by aggressively targeting a particular police department that's probably insured against these kinds of damage payments. And then all the effort that we engage in focusing on sort of punishing one particular person and just like obliterating them off the face of public life is a huge drain of energy and resources that we could spend and should spend on systemic change. And then there's also another issue, and I want to talk about this very, very carefully, and that's the issue of placing victims at the forefront of policy and reform. Now, I should say that validating and empowering victims in itself is very important. But the way we've come to do this is deeply compromised because our victim-centered punitive process is reifying victimization to a point that is unhealthy not just to the offenders but also to the victims. Right? We're essentially encouraging people, we're communicating a message, and this is not unique to progressives, this I think is true for the entire victim rights movement in the United States. We're communicating this message that the way you get the talking stick in American society is by being a victim. Like your master status is that of a potential victim. And by doing that, we're encouraging ourselves and others to marinate in our victimization for much longer than is good for us and much longer than science said is good for us. We're basically courting more and more and more rage. And we're silencing voices of victims who might not feel that punitive. And in fact, many victims of violent crime in the United States are not that punitive. They're not necessarily in favor of the death penalty. They're not necessarily on board with a punitive agenda, but there seems to be one monolithic way to be a victim in the United States, and that's to be punitive, and that is silencing and problematic. Then there's the fact that we rely a lot on identity as a logic that underpins these targets. So rather than saying, well, we'll take each of these cases and we'll look at the evidence and we'll see what happens, we're going to go with hashtags, right? Believe women, believe children, believe people of color, because they are women, children, people of color, poor people. But in a universe of intersectional identities, the consequences of this are quite unclear. One example that some of our listeners might remember is Corner Store Carolyn, this woman who complains that she's being harassed by an 8-year-old boy at a store. And it turns out the complaint is ultimately unfounded, right? And in a world in which we're sort of judging people, whether we should believe them or not, based on sort of their demographic category, what do we do in a case like this? If we want to believe women, where does that leave the boy that was falsely accused? If we want to believe people of color, what do we do when we realize that most crime is committed intraracially and those people victimize victims of color? So what do we do with these situations? It's not particularly healthy to confound the personal with the political and the individual facts with the interest of protecting groups and identities. It leaves all of these dilemmas unanswered. So one more thing that is really scary to me is that a lot of these punitive campaigns can backfire in really horrific ways. One example that I'm actually still concerned about is the recall campaign for Judge Persky, the judge who gave Brock Turner, the guy from Stanford that was convicted of sexual assault, a punishment that was considered by many people, particularly people who haven't been in a prison and don't realize what registration as a sex offender means, as being a very lenient punishment. So we can agree or disagree on whether Brock Turner received a lenient punishment or not for what he did, which I think we can all agree was pretty horrid. But what we can say is that by making a huge recall campaign against the judge who essentially followed the recommendation of the probation officers, what kind of message are we sending to judges? We're saying, look, we never punish judges for being too harsh. We only come down on judges if they're being too lenient. And who is going to be the first person in line to suffer from this? It's going to be exactly the people that this progressive movement purports to protect. It's going to be young men of color who look nothing like Brock Turner, whose lives are nothing like Brock Turner's, but they're going to be at the first line of people to suffer from these kinds of movements. And I consider this incredibly scary and dangerous.
And so, I mean, I think most people, most people, as you say, we grew up in this, in this culture where punitivism and the criminal system is kind of our only way that we can really conceive of creating social change. And so, why would it then not be the case that if we totally destroy the Brock Turners of the world or the Brett Kavanaughs of the world, or the police, like Darren Wilson, for example, who shot Mike Brown and Ferguson, if we could just destroy them, then wouldn't that ward off or cause other people to reconsider their actions? I think that's probably what a lot of people would think. And so what would be your response to that?
Right. And that's right. That's the hope of people who pursue these kinds of crusades, right? Is the idea that, this case is going to spark a national conversation that's going to change things. The problem is what we know is that the national conversation doesn't really happen. And when it happens, it doesn't happen the way that progressive punitivists hope that it will happen. The classic example is Kavanaugh, right? Everybody's saying, well, now there's going to be this big discussion. We're all going to come to this, big national moment of thinking about Me Too and thinking about sexual assault. And then you have the public opinion surveys before and after the testimonies, and you find out that people, including women, because 77% of Republican women strongly supported Kavanaugh before and after the testimonies, these sort of things don't change minds. They tend to alienate. They don't create coalitions. We're just eating our own, basically.
And that was one of the things that I noticed in your paper that I really wanted to ask you about, is this idea that as we become more punitive, as we become more and try to use these punitive tools to achieve social justice ends, that the response from the quote unquote other side, or the people that we are directing this punitivism towards, is not necessarily to change, but is to kind of circle the wagons and become, as you said, alienated.
Exactly. This was very clear in the Kavanaugh case. It was very clear in the Darren Wilson case. And it's distressing because this is exactly the opposite of what this movement is purporting to do. And what's more, what is worse is that sometimes when people express doubts about these strategies, then this kind of scorched earth mentalities lead to the demonization and the destruction, even of people who are saying, hey, let's think for a moment, is this really a good thing to do? And then people get accused of tone policing, and they get labeled as, being the bad guy. And there's just no end to this. The left is just going to eat its own until there's nobody left.
And so another question that I wanted to ask you, and you talked about this earlier in the interview, is this notion of ratcheting up punishment. And I think in the paper you talk about it in the context of hate crime legislation and domestic terrorism, which of course has been, rather unfortunately in the national conversation lately. So when you say ratcheting up punishment, I guess I have two questions. One is, what do we mean by ratcheting up as compared to the alternative? And why do you think that is? Why do you think that is seems to be our default response to perceived inadequacy of punishment?
So I think the ultimate expression of the ratcheting up idea is something that many of our listeners are probably familiar with, and that's sort of the classic Facebook meme. And what that usually consists of is we're going to pick two cases out of the whole universe of cases with different circumstances and complicated issues and detail and whatever. We're going to pick two cases and we're going to compare them to each other. There's going to be, on one side, there's going to be a picture of a poor person of color who's been treated harshly. And on the other side, there's going to be a picture of a privileged white person who's been treated leniently, right? We're going to compare those two side by side. And the argument is going to be, why isn't the white person punished the way that the black person was punished? Or why isn't the rich person punished the way that the poor person was punished? And it's interesting that the argument gets made this way rather than in the opposite way, which is, why can't we be lenient toward everyone? Shirin Sinar and other people writing about domestic terrorism have written quite a bit about the campaign to sort of define these acts that are, again, admittedly horrific acts of violence as domestic terrorism. Now, in terms of the actual practical consequences of this, there aren't huge consequences to calling a mass murder terrorism or calling it mass murder, right? It's not going to make an enormous difference, right? And, we still have the death penalty on the federal level. We're still going to punish these things harshly. And frankly, a mass shooting isn't less or more horrible whether we call it terrorism or not. It's horrible because it's a mass shooting. It doesn't matter what you call it. But we have the feeling that we sort of have to symbolic call it something, because otherwise we're somehow sort of coming up short in the way we treat white supremacists as opposed to the way we treat other noxious ideologies that yield these mass atrocities. And people who have studied international terrorism and the way tribunals happen will say, look, it's not that these are not horrific deeds. Yes, they are horrific deeds, but when you look at the way we prosecute and convict and punish international terrorism, we're finding huge problems with due process. And rather than fixing those, which is to say, let's get those international tribunals to the same standards of due process that we apply domestically to cases like this, we're saying the opposite, right? We're saying let's treat these people as terrorists too and take the due process away from them. Now, there's something very natural about it. Of course, we hear about horrific things. We hear about losses. This has been a particularly painful week, I think, for all of us. And it's very natural and very human to feel rage. And I think many of us are under the impression that feeling rage and expressing rage is a good thing. It's going to feel cathartic, right? We need to get it out, right? There's all this talk about how if we're not enraged, we're not paying attention. And frankly, it's easy to be enraged these days. There's lots of upsetting things happening. So there's this notion that kind of like there's something good, there's something constructive about being angry. And the truth is a little bit more complicated, because it's true that anger really propels you to action. But the idea that anger provides a catharsis or a relief seems to not really jive with what we know from psychology about this. And the truth about anger is more that anger turns out to be a generative emotion. It's less like, like you have something, a toaster within you. You're going to get it out, and then the toaster is going to be out. You're going to feel better. Anger is more like phlegm. The more we express anger, the more angry we feel. And I think many of us have been feeling this over the course of the last 3 years, where the anger is just endless. It's like, every morning there's something new to be outraged about, and if you exercise the outrage muscles, they're gonna get a good workout, right? But it doesn't seem to make us less angry, and it doesn't seem to have helped us solve the problem, right? I mean, another example where I see the same thing operating is it feels like in the area of, celebrities apologizing for, behaving poorly and, harassing women and making women uncomfortable and sometimes assaulting women. We've come into this pattern where all we do is we write the same op-ed again and again and again and again, where we're taking a celebrity's apology. I think the recent, story I read was about Aziz Ansari on the New Yorker. And we're going to, engage in this endless dissection of the apology and whether it's sufficient, whether this person gets to be back on the public stage. I don't even know what gets means, and who, gives people license to resume public life, right? Subject people to all these, thought, re-education campaigns. And we have endless enthusiasm for this. It's not helping. It's making things worse. I don't feel safer. I don't think other women feel safer because of these, endless dissections and criticisms and essentially punishments in the public court of the internet. The electric guillotine is not making anybody safer. And that's sad to say, because I think a lot of us, a lot of well-intended, informed people are saying, well, I don't know how to do anything else. I'm just angry. And it's because we don't have good other things to do, because we've gotten so used to the fact that the only tool we have is punishing and shaming and destroying and obliterating, that we don't have anything else. The arsenal is just empty.
And so that's what I was going to ask you, and perhaps this is really the $64,000 question, but is there a way to sort of thread the needle or navigate the middle path between holding individual bad actors responsible for, as we've talked about, sometimes, truly atrocious conduct without reliance on, progressive punitivism or conservative punitivism, or, without, I guess, seeing the criminal legal system as the main mechanism behind which we can advance social change? Do you see a way that we can navigate that?
So in the piece, I have two ideas on how we might pursue things like this. One of them is to do something more akin to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people who have been harmed and people who have committed harm can come together and can talk about what they did and can come to some sort of healing. Part of the problem that we're experiencing is that this medium of punishment is turning out to be a very poor venue for offering and receiving apologies. So if someone like Louis C.K. or Aziz Ansari or someone like that wants to apologize, it's going to be automatically interpreted, and understandably so, as this person's trying to save his career. He's just doing this because he doesn't want to be guillotined, right? And in that climate, how can anybody ever offer an apology that is going to be perceived as genuine? So we have to come up with some way of conversation that is not punitive, that doesn't sound as if the person's been, in a re-education camp in Siberia, right? And it gives the person some path for redemption and gives the other side, the harmed side, the satisfaction that if they are getting an apology, it's a genuine, heartfelt apology. It's not a means to an end. So that's one way to think or work about this. The other thing that I think we should start doing more seriously is early age education. Rather than looking post-hoc at what happened and thinking, okay, how can we now remedy this? Who do we need to cut down so that everybody will feel better? Let's try to prevent these things from happening in the first place. So a classic example in the context of Me Too is this astounding piece of information that I've learned that children are socialized to segregate by gender from an incredibly young age. So even from preschool, boys are encouraged to associate with boys, girls are encouraged to associate with girls. Why don't we make an effort in early age education for everybody to socialize together, which might teach them that people of another gender are also human beings just like them, and prevent a lot of these miscommunications, misunderstandings, and sometimes just, downright objectification and use that people do to each other that cause, untold harm and suffering. And so investing in prevention and in trying to raise a generation of people that are sensitive to others, that see others as people who are deserving of dignity and respect, seems to be a better path than to try to kind of like, after the bad things have already happened, to just come down on people and expect to get gratification from that.
And so to sum this up, the last question that I have for you is, in your paper, you also draw on a pretty significant amount of history in tracing the development of progressive punitivism. And I guess I'm just really curious, what do you see the odds are of us sort of turning from progressive punitivism and charting a different course that doesn't rely on punitivism versus potentially the pendulum just continuing to swing back and forth and just demolishing whoever's on the sort of business end of it?
This is a really sad question to ponder, because I think that we've gotten so habituated to think about, who can we punish, who can we clobber on any side of the political divide, that it's very hard to be sort of the side that's going to give that up in some way and try to understand the other side. And when I try to trace the intellectual history of this, I come to this really interesting conclusion, because I'm looking for it in white-collar criminology. I'm looking for it in radical feminism. I even go as far as to go to communist China to look at the law in communist China to see where is this idea of punishing dissidents coming from. And I eventually come to the conclusion that progressive punitivism is the same as conservative punitivism. They come from the same place. They're just applied in different directions, but there actually isn't a novelty here. And I think that one avenue that is promising, and I really hope that we can pursue it as a society, is the idea that we tend to see others through this kind of, I'll call it essence of enemy after Robert Wright, right? If the person's on the other side, then they're the enemy. And we're going to interpret anything the person says or does in light of that assumption. Letting go of the idea that there is an other, that people are fundamentally different from us, that they're not human, that there's not talking to them, is essential for dismantling this kind of thinking. And I think I can sort of, as I say this, I can almost hear my progressive friends and colleagues saying, yeah, but if we're the only ones making the effort, then the Trump voters aren't making the effort, then we're going to kind of we're going to be weak, right? We're going to come up short. But the key is that it's not weakness. it's very important to be vulnerable because the only path toward human connection is going to come from that. And in any case, I think the posturing is not really helping, so we have got to try something else.
I think on that, you, me, and probably a not insignificant number of people would completely agree. Hadar, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Says, good morning, Judge. I got arrested once, all on a humbug. Said, good morning, Judge. What may be my fine? Now here we are, song to the judge. Good morning, Judge, what may be my fine? Good morning, Judge, what may be my fine? Good morning, Judge, what may be my fine? $50 and $11.29. They arrest me for murder. I ain't never harmed a man. They arrest me for murder and I ain't never harmed a man. Arrest me for forgery and I can't even sign my name. Don't ever let a woman treat you like mine treat me. Don't ever let your woman treat you like mine treat me. Don't let your woman treat you like mine treat me. Treat you like someone she ain't never seen. I went to the gypsy where they get my ham bone done. I went to the gypsy to get my ham bone done. Went to the gypsy to get my ham bone done. Gypsy said, for I declare you sure need one. When the world is the matter, we can't get along. Baby, what's the matter? We can't get along. Tell the world I ain't gonna be here long. We can't get along. Something wrong, we can't get along. Tell me whatever have I done. Tell me, baby, whatever have I done? Tell me, baby, whatever have I done? Blood in my body done got too low to run. They said, do not help me none. Look like Lord have mercy, don't help for none. I done tried it. Tell me what evil have I done. Guitar, sing that for me once. Lord have mercy, don't